Today, the office of the President of Ukraine shocked everyone with the news that the Lukashenko regime is actively building roads in the border areas of Belarus leading into Ukrainian territory and setting up artillery positions to fire on Ukraine. This statement was made by the President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, after a report from the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Oleksandr Syrsky. Therefore, Ukrainian intelligence has already warned Lukashenko that he will become a legitimate military target. At the same time, according to the Institute for the Study of War, the Kremlin is using Belarus to prepare for war with the Baltic states as well. And this is especially important given that even the former Russian defense minister, Sergei Shoigu, has openly threatened the Baltic states and Finland with war and even made a sort of request to the UN for the application of Article 51 of the UN Charter, which stipulates the right to self-defense. In addition, it is worth remembering that in the last 2 weeks, dictator Lukashenko has already stated twice that he is indeed preparing the country for war and has called for mobilizing all the country's forces for combat operations. So what is happening, and should we be worried that Belarus might be drawn into the war against Ukraine again? That's what we're going to talk about today. Поговорим. My name is Alexei Pechi, let's discuss this topic together. But before we start, please like the video, subscribe to the channel and leave any comment below this video. And subscribe to my Telegram channel, Pechi News, the link is in the description. So, in the border regions of Belarus, roads are being built and expanded leading to the territory of Ukraine, as well as the establishment of artillery positions deployed towards us. Russia will once again try to drag Belarus into its war. This was reported by the President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, after a meeting with the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Oleksandr Syrsky. Zelensky immediately instructed the relevant channels to warn the de facto leadership of Belarus about Ukraine's readiness to defend its land and independence. According to Zelensky, there was a report from Commander-in-Chief Oleksandr Syrsky on the situation at the front. Quote, "First of all, the situation at the front. I thank all our units who are holding their positions and repelling Russian assaults. In April, the pace of eliminating the occupiers remains high. Russia has not been able to seize the initiative at the front, and this is important. An attempt by the occupying forces has been observed to regroup their troops, most likely to compensate for a shortage of personnel. In this regard, it is becoming more obvious why the armed forces have increased their activity on the territory of Belarus. Let me remind you, Lukashenko recently conducted a combat readiness check of the Belarusian army there. And now comes the most important part of Zelensky's quote. According to our intelligence, in the border regions of Belarus, roads leading to the territory of Ukraine are being developed and artillery positions are being established. We believe that Russia will once again try to drag Belarus into its war. I have given the relevant instructions to Crimea. Through the channels, I have warned the de facto leadership of Belarus about Ukraine's readiness to defend its land and independence. The nature and consequences of recent events in Venezuela should deter the leadership of Belarus from making mistakes. So, that was a hint that if Belarus gets dragged into the war, Lukashenko should fear for his safety, as he will become a real military target and could share the fate of Nicolas Maduro. And it's important to remember here that Lukashenko himself is now actively talking about preparing for war. At a meeting on the results of a comprehensive inspection of the country's armed forces back on April 1st, Lukashenko stated that Belarus is preparing for war and emphasized that there can be no peacetime. The inspection itself was described by the Belarusian dictator as larger in scale and tougher than ever before. During the inspection, military units were placed in conditions as close to combat as possible. Next, please excuse me, I will quote the dictator Lukashenko. "We are preparing for war. That is why we created the armed forces. That is why we maintain them. That is why the people pay money. If suddenly someone decides to talk to us and look at us down the sights of their weapons, we will respond. That is what we are preparing for. In the event of war, Belarus can increase the number of troops to 500,000 people. The level of tasks and the pace of their completion during the inspection were determined by the seriousness of the geopolitical situation, events, and threats from outside. In this Well, in this light, it's also worth adding that on March 26, not so long ago, Lukashenko and the leader of North Korea, Kim Jong-un, signed a treaty of friendship and cooperation between their countries in Pyongyang. According to the statement from Lukashenko's press service, the head of North Korea, Kim Jong-un, also expressed solidarity and full support for Belarus and, I quote, spoke out against the illegal pressure of the West on Minsk. In addition, Lukashenko stated that the governments of Belarus and North Korea, I quote, share the same views on international issues. And it's important to remember here that both North Korea and Belarus are providing significant support to Russia in its war against Ukraine. Pyongyang is sending ammunition to Russia и северокорейских военнослужащих. And in February 2022, Minsk provided Moscow with Belarusian territory as a staging ground for the full-scale invasion of Ukraine and agreed to host Russian tactical nuclear weapons on its territory. And on this matter, at the beginning of this year, the Institute for the Study of War wrote that Russia is increasingly using Belarusian territory as an area from which Moscow conducts operations of an informational and psychological nature against NATO countries. According to analysts at the Institute, the regular intrusion of drones or balloons into the airspace of Poland and Lithuania from Belarusian territory is part of the so-called Phase 0 of a possible conflict. And now I'll quote. The Institute for the Study of War still believes that Russia has de facto annexed Belarus and is using incursions into the airspace of Poland and Lithuania from Belarusian territory. As part of Phase 0, the information psychological phase, it is creating conditions to prepare for a possible war between NATO and Russia in the future. This clarification is especially important against the backdrop of the Kremlin actively laying the informational groundwork for an attack on the Baltic countries in recent weeks. I talked about this in detail in the previous episode. Be sure to go to the channel and watch it. But the Kremlin also wants to create it right away. Several points of tension on the territory of Belarus so that absolutely all of Belarus's neighbors are forced to constantly be on alert. And here it is already assumed that the same inspection of the Belarusian army was done so that, if necessary, Belarusians could actually be sent to war against Ukraine. Not necessarily from their territory, but at any point on the front. Well, because the Russians have started having problems with their personnel. And so, on April 14, Lukashenko once again repeats that the country is preparing for war. That's why he's demanding that his officials mobilize in order to get through these difficult times. And I'll finish this episode with a quote from the dictator Lukashenko. We need to mobilize now to get through these difficult times. These are also uncertain times. As president, I don't know what to prepare you for. We're working just to live. That's our only slogan. We work to live. Not just to survive, but to live. No one knows what will happen next, and what the powers that be will do. I'll leave it at that. Share your thoughts and opinions on this in the comments below this episode. And if you want to support the work of this channel, you can do so using the links and details in the description of this video. I would appreciate your donations. That's all for now. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye, everyone.